Britain is a nation that is obsessed with weather and delays. They talk about this topic all the time. In fact, 21% of the Brits says that they look at their weather forecast apps the first time they reach out their phones once they wake up. Not surprising because I'm included. But let's take London as an example. Its weather notoriously volatile. We can leave the house with a jacket under clear sky to only encounter with the downpour, cats and dogs, rains and sudden gust of wind by midday, and followed by hot sunny afternoon. And suddenly the jacket become burdened. That's true, so fair enough. And then we have 18% of the Brits that they say that they always check on their commute disruptions. While the habit is national, but the intensity of travel checking is heavily concentrated in London. Well, in most of UK, people commute with car and might check a basic maps apps for the traffic. But in London, over 80% of morning commutes rely on public transport. A single signal failure in London Underground can disrupt an entire morning. Now imagine if the London Underground stops operating altogether. Well, there are alternatives, yes, such as overground or buses, but commuting is supposed to be routine, something we do every day out of habit, automatic. So we don't want to think about it. You can imagine you arrived at the office, you haven't even started job and you already feeling exhausted. And that is exactly what the Londoners feel every time the TfL, Transport for London, strike. In 2026 alone, the industrial strike happened every month. Last April, and then followed by May, and then June. It is very understandable when people start asking, like, why are they striking again? Will there be another strike in the upcoming month? And then it's escalating, like, don't tube drivers already make over £70,000 a year? What else do they want? And then another question will be like, is our minimum wage policy completely failing? So many questions. But today, we're going to look past those angry tweets and the superficial headlines. We're going to treat London's transport network, the TfL, not just as a way to get from point A to point B, but as a living, breathing laboratory for political economy. Here is the fascinating paradox of London. Inside the same transport network, you have tube drivers who earn highly comfortable upper middle class salaries protected by incredibly powerful unions. But right next to them, cleaning the same stations and guarding the same platforms, we have the outsourced cleaners and security guards who are heavily reliant on the state mandated London living wage just to buy groceries. How can one public system contain both extremes? Is this a failure of minimum wage policy or is it a symptom of something that is much more deep? To answer this, we're going to use some economic frameworks. Specifically, we're going to look at the world of the TfL through the lens of German post-Keynesian economist Hans-Jörg Herr, alongside some classic concepts like dual labor market theory and power resources theory. Now, let's start with our theoretical framework. Hans-Jörg Herr's core argument can be broken down into universal simple term. In mainstream traditional economics, what we call the neoclassical paradigm, the labor market is viewed just like any other market, like the market for apples or for smartphones. Therefore, this mainstream theory assumes that labor markets have an intrinsic self-regulating equilibrium. It means like if there are too many workers and not enough jobs, wages should naturally fall. If wages fall, business will hire more people and the market clears. As simple as that. Therefore, From a strict neoclassical viewpoint, if a government sets a statutory minimum wage too high, it creates an artificial rigidity because it disrupts the natural balancing mechanism. Because now the wages are legally prevented from adjusting downward to clear the market. Eventually, it will create unemployment. But Hans Jorker says suddenly, hold on a minute, that's not how the world works. Let's see how the perspective of Herr. So, Hans Jörg Herr built his framework on the original Keynesian paradigm. So he argues that the labor market is fundamentally different from a market for apples. It cannot regulate itself. How come? Because employment levels are not determined by the price of labor. They are determined by aggregate demand in the goods markets and investment choices in financial markets. Let's think about it this way. So if people don't have money to buy things, companies will not hire workers no matter how cheap labor becomes. In conclusion, the labor market is entirely dependent on what happens to the rest of the economy. Furthermore, Herr introduces a beautiful concept called the nominal anchor theory. To make it easier for us to imagine, let's think about a boat on the ocean. Without an anchor, it drifts uncontrollably. And in a modern world where we are living now, money is just like the boat. It has no real value on its own. It's just paper or digital code in our screen. So, what keeps the value of money steady? What stops the prices drifting out of control? Hans Jörg Herr says the secret anchor is labor, specifically unit labor cost. What is unit labor cost? It is the exact amount of money it costs to pay a worker to make one single item. Why does this unit labor cost work as an anchor for the money? First, because everything we buy requires human work. Food, cars, what else? Smartphones, or haircuts, all need labor. And then, second, wages are stable. They do not change wildly every hour like the stock prices do. Because the cost of the work stays steady, the cost of products also stays steady. That is the anchor. So, it is the human effort at the end that gives our paper money its true stable value. It very makes sense. So let's see another scenario. If there is a massive crisis and an unregulated labor market allows wages to collapse, what will happen? The entire economy risks falling into a catastrophic deflationary trap where prices drop, business collapse, and a downward spiral begins. It sounds so scary just because of the wages collapse. But I don't try to scare no one in here. This isn't just a theory, it is real. We saw it happen in real life during Japan's lost decades, where the economy got stuck in this exact trap for over 20 years. So, when wages collapse, the economic anchor breaks and the entire ship sinks. On the other hand, if wages explode too fast and completely out of control, what will happen? You will get hyperinflation. Money becomes utterly worthless. So, how do we keep this economy stable? Hans Jorker says we cannot just leave wages to chance. We need strong institutions. I repeat, we need strong institutions like laws or unions to guide them. He even created a simple recipe for the perfect wage increase. He says that every year pay raises should match exactly two things added together. First, the productivity growth. It is about how much faster or better workers are making things. And second, target inflation, the small healthy price increase that the central banks wants to see. This too. So if workers get better at their jobs, they get paid more. If the cost of living goes up a tiny bit, they get paid a tiny bit more to match it. Fair. And by using this exact math formula, wages grow safely, the anchor holds tight, and the economy stays perfectly balanced. But Hare points out another major risk: the wage dispersion trap. In an unregulated market, the gap between the highest paid workers and the lowest paid workers widens dramatically. This creates a massive class of the working poor.
Welcome to the salary trap, where you trade your entire life for just enough money to survive until
What
one
is
day.
the working poor? These are people who work full time jobs but still cannot afford even the basic necessities. When millions of workers are trapped in low paying jobs, the entire economy will stall. How come? Well, because they simply do not have enough money to spend. If people cannot buy goods, business cannot sell goods and the whole system slows down. To fix this, Head says we cannot just pick a random minimum wage out of a hat. Instead, the government must set a strong, meaningful legal minimum wage. This act like a solid floor for the economy, and by raising this floor, we lift the lowest earners up, close the unfair gap, and give regular people the spending power needed to fuel the whole economy. So now we got the concept. Hold on to the thought, which is the idea of compressing the wide gap from below and necessity of institutional anchors, because it is the exact key that we need to unlock the puzzle of transport for London. When you look at the TfL through a political economy lens, you quickly realize that it is not a single uniform labor market. Instead, it is a textbook example of what the economists Peter Doeringer and Michael Piore call a dual labor market. Let's break down these two distinct tiers. Tier 1 is the primary labor market. These are the directly employed TfL staff, the tube drivers, the train operators, the station managers. This sector features high wages, incredible job security, and rare gold standard defined benefit final salary pensions. How come? Because these jobs require extensive safety critical training and specialized knowledge of London's complex underground infrastructure. You cannot just hire someone off the street to drive a Piccadilly line train tomorrow morning, don't you? Because they are highly specialized, the TfL management invests heavily on them. They protect them, they pay them well, they lock them into a secure inner circle of TfL. Then we look at the tier 2. These are the secondary labor market inside the TfL. These are the outsourced workers, the cleaners, the security guards, the catering staff, and they do not actually work for TfL. They work for the private outside companies that TfL hires. This sector is characterized by historically low union power, high staff turnover, and risky contracts. Well, while tier 1 drivers are protected in an inner circle, these tier 2 workers are left on the outside facing much tougher, less stable conditions. In a purely free, unregulated market neoclassical setup, private companies would do something brutal to win contracts. To win a deal with TfL, these outside companies would compete by cutting their workers' pay to the absolute bare legal minimum. It is a race to the bottom, where the cleaners and security guards pay the ultimate price. But this is where Hans Joker's institutional intervention comes alive. To stop these workers from becoming the exploited working poor because of the wage dispersion trap, the local government steps in and stops the race. Since 2016, the Mayor of London has forced the TfL to be an official London living wage employer. This means TfL and any private company working for them is banned from paying poverty wages. Instead, they must pay a baseline rate of 14.80 pound per hour, and that is significantly higher than the standard UK minimum wage, giving these essential workers a solid livable floor under their feet. What does this mandate do macroeconomically to these private contracting firms that work for the TfL? First, it completely strips away their ability to win the public bids by undercutting the human labor. It forces them to play on equal terms. Since they cannot cut the wages below 14.80 pound, competition shift from wage exploitation to operational efficiency. Second, their profit margins get squeezed tight, especially if they are locked into a fixed price multi years contract with TfL. And to survive, these private firms are forced to adapt. But a fascinating thing will happen. So they actually will get more productive. How? At least in two ways. First, because the pay is finally good, so the workers will stop quitting. The company saves a fortune on the constant cost of recruiting, hiring, and training in new people. And second, to offset this higher hourly cost of human labor, the companies start replacing basic manual tasks with technology. They invest in high tech cleaning machinery and advanced digital software to manage their facilities. So, when we look at the tier 2, the secondary labor market, and TFL, the London Living Wage policy isn't a failure at all. It is a highly successful institutional floor that protects vulnerable workers and shifts income distribution exactly the way Hans-Jörg Herr envisioned. But that brings us back to our big question in the first place. If the living wage floor is working for the tier 2, so why on earth do the tier 1 workers who are very competitive already keep going on strike? What is happening? Before we answer the big question about why this tier 1 worker keep doing the strike, let's test one more time the power of Hans-Jörg Herr's framework. And to do that, let's step off a bit from the underground platform and walk outside onto the streets of London. Let's talk about those iconic red double-decker buses. To the average tourist, the tube and the buses look like part of the exact same unified system. They both display the famous TfL round the logo, and you tap in with the exact same Oyster card. But from a political economy perspective, they are different like sky and earth. While the London Underground is operated directly by the local government via TfL, the London bus network is fully privatized. Let's look at how this came to be. Back in the mid 1980s and 1990s, the UK government aggressively deregulated and privatized public transport. In London, they settled on a franchise model. So TfL does not actually own the business or employ the drivers. Instead, TfL divides London's bus routes into hundreds of individual corporate packages and puts them up for competitive tender. And then private multinational transport giants like Go Ahead, Stagecoach, Arriva, and Metroline bid against each other to win the right to run specific routes for a set number of years. So, what does this privatization do to this labor market? It triggers exactly what Hans-Jörg Herr warns against us all the time: severe institutional fragmentation and a dangerous downward pressure on the nominal wage anchor. Let me elaborate. On the London Underground, because TfL is a single employer, there is only one unified collective bargaining agreement. A tube driver in the Central Line makes the exact same salary as the tube driver on the Piccadilly line. But on the London buses, it's different scenario because there are around a dozen different private operators competing to win contracts with the TfL, the labor market was intentionally fractured. For decades, each private bus company negotiated its own separate pay rates with the workers. This led to a staggering wage disparity. You could have two bus drivers sitting at the exact same traffic light in central London, driving identical red buses, but because they work for different private corporations, one driver was being paid up to £6,000 a year less than the driver next to them. How tragic. And this is the textbook manifestation of wage dispersion trap. In a privatized competitive tendering system, private operators view labor purely through a neoclassical lens as a variable production cost that must be aggressively minimized to keep their contracts bids cheap and their corporate shareholders happy. So, without a strong institutional anchor, which means the local government removes its wage protection, the private companies start undercutting each other to survive. It is another race to the bottom. For the bus drivers, this means an incredibly stressful workplace. Barely any time to take a break, exhausting shift patterns, and severe fatigue. All while the money they bring home buys less and less every year. So, how did the system survive? The London bus system survived without collapsing into a total low wage crisis. Once again, institutional intervention had to step in to fight the market. Gladly, the London bus drivers are not fighting alone. Unions like Unite spotted a major flaw in the system. They realized that striking against only one private bus company did not give them much power. Unlike a tube strike that shuts down the whole city, an isolated bus strike just means people take another different bus route. So, Unite fought back with a massive multi year campaign. And what is their goal? Sectoral bargaining, which basically means setting one minimum wage floor for every single bus driver in London.
RACP is a French company. All the other garages, they've all got their rises.
Every other company in the whole of London, really, has actually paid 2.4, 2.5%.
I mean, you look at Mexico, that's got 3.5%. We're way behind everyone. We're way behind. We've got to take a stand.
They demanded that TfL make the pay rate a legal rule. If a private company wants to win a contract to run London buses, they must respect this wage floor. So when we look this through the lens of Hans Jürger's framework, the introduction of this sectoral wage floor acted as an artificial stabilizing anchor. It forced these private transport giants to stop competing by depressing driver wages. Instead, just like the outsourced cleaners we talked about before, these private bus companies were forced to find profits through better fleet management, transitioning to electric buses, and optimizing fuel efficiency. So, we will see once again the transformation from wage exploitation to operational efficiency. Ultimately, the London's buses prove once again a huge point about public infrastructure. If you leave it entirely up to privatized free market model, the system will break. It naturally creates a massive pay gaps and exploits the workers. To fix it, you need a strong collective force. It takes aggressive unions, pressure, and strict government rules to step in and force private companies to pay a true living wage. First thing first, let's address the elephant in the room. Are these frequent tube strikes a failure of the minimum wage policy? No. The answer is no. Minimum wage policy has absolutely nothing to do with the tube strikes. Why? Because these tube drivers are completely insulated from the low wage sector. They don't earn minimum wage. They earn an average salary of roughly 72 until 74,000 pounds a year. Their strikes are about protecting a high wage premium, not fighting for a basic legal floor. Therefore, to understand why they strike, we need to look past the minimum wage laws and focus on a concept called power resources theory. It is developed by a Swedish sociologist, Walter Corby. This theory simply says workers win better pay when they hold all the cards. Let's crack into it. Tube drivers has massive leverage because they can easily shut down London's economy. In political science, we call it as a structural power. It means your pay and your perks don't depend on how hard you work, but on how much damage you can cause by striking. Because a tube strike paralyzes the city, management has always gives in their demands. Now think about it. If a local shop goes on strike, you just have to walk down the street to the competitor. No biggie, no big deal. But if tube drivers go on strike, London freezes instantly. Offices empty, shop lose customer, and the economy bleeds tens of millions a day. It's a big number. This is what the economists call marketplace power at a strategic bottleneck. When you combine this choke point with a massive union backup where nearly 90% of the drivers stand together, you get a workforce that can say no to management, shut down the city, and win every single time. So, what are they fighting over right now? Take the TfL's proposal for a 4-day work week. To an outsider, a 4-day work week sounds amazing. It means more days off. But in reality, it is a brutal battle for control. The unions are firstly resisting it because compressing the same hours into fewer days means longer grueling shifts. This leads to extreme driver fatigue and burnout while giving management the power to chop and change the rotas with zero notice. They are also striking to protect their gold plated pension from government funding cuts. It is a defensive war to guard their hard earned benefits at a time when the rest of the economy is losing theirs. Now, whenever these strikes happen, the critics always scream like, fine, let's just automate this whole network, introduce driverless trains, and break the unions once and for all. It sounds like an obvious fix, right? Get rid of the drivers, get rid of the strikes. But this is where the reality hits a multi billion pound brick wall. TfL's own internal reports prove that driverless trains are a financial fantasy, unfortunately, because to fully automate older, deep underground lines like Central or Piccadilly lines would cost a staggering 4 until 10 billion pound just for one line. Imagine you would have to rebuild a tiny century-old tunnels, install thousands and thousands of glass platform doors, and completely tear out signaling system from the last century. TfL itself concluded there is simply no business case for it. The idea is completely off the table. The astronomical upfront costs far outweigh any money saved by cutting the driver wages. So, in short, the human driver isn't going anywhere, and their ultimate leverage remains completely secure. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. How do the politicians see all of this? Because at its core, the battle over the London Underground is an ideological war for the soul of the UK economy. On one side is the left, represented by the Mayor of London and the Labour Party. They see trade unions as legitimate partners. To them, Policies like the London Living Wage are massive moral victories that protect everyday workers from being exploited by the system. When strikes happen, they act like a frustrated referee caught between trying to keep London moving and refusing to crush the worker rights. On the complete flip side is the right, the conservative view. They look at the TfL through the lens of strict corporate efficiency and fiscal discipline. To them, high driver salaries and constant strikes are not signs of a worker power. They are market distortions. They view the unions as monopolies holding the capital city hostage. Their solution is aggressive and structural. Push for the automations, pass laws to ban full strikes, and cut costs to protect the taxpayer. When you look at London Underground, you are watching two completely different economic philosophies battle for control. So, what is the ultimate takeaway? The TfL case study teaches us that the labor market is not a simple mathematical equation. It is an arena of a continuous political and social conflict. It shows us that the minimum wage policies are a vital defensive shield. They are absolutely necessary to protect vulnerable, unorganized workers in the secondary market from a race to the bottom. Hence, your care is entirely correct. Without institutional floor like the London Living Wage, competitive markets will naturally create a working poor class, degrading human dignity and harming aggregate demands. But the tube strikes prove that a minimum wage is only a shield. It cannot buy industrial peace. For workers to get true balance, they also need an offensive sword, the collective power to stand together, fight for their conditions, and demand their fair share of wealth they create. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this deep dive. I hope this episode helped you to look past the standard media headlines and give you a deeper look on how politics, economy, and human labor clash in our everyday lives. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification. It genuinely helps a small, independent creator like me to reach more curious mind like yours. And before you go, I have a question to think about. Do you think a city's transport system should be run strictly like a lean business, focusing entirely on cost efficiency and cutting down labor? Or do you think public infrastructure should prioritize protecting worker rights and paying strong wages, even if it means dealing with the occasional disruption of a strike? Let me know your thoughts down below. I've been Sepere Aude. Until next time, have the courage to make sense this world. Ciao!